Hi, welcome to another dose of virtual vitamin Z. My name is Stephen, and I'm the curator of Humane Education for the Detroit Zoological Society. Today, I'm going to continue talking about animal communication, and in particular, I'm going to talk about communication that happens not just between two or more individuals of the same species, but actually occurs between different species. And to do that, I'm going to focus on the giraffe and the acacia tree. And as we talk about this, we're going to use a few terms. And a couple of those terms are a review from previously in the week. One of those is communication. And again, communication is the exchange of meanings between two or more individuals. And nonverbal communication is a type of communication that relies upon things other than vocalizations or sounds, things like gestures or things like pheromones. We're also going to be using some new terms, and I'll introduce these in context, but I did want to show them to you right away. One of those is signal, another one is cause and effect, a third is chain reaction, fourth is root metaphor, and then intraspecies communication and interspecies communication. So the relationship between the acacia tree and the giraffe is one that has evolved over many, many, many years. And so when we think about it, we're not thinking about individual giraffes or individual acacia trees. Rather, we're thinking about the species giraffe and the species acacia tree. And because it takes place over many, many years, it might be hard for us as humans to really kind of process that. And so I'm going to introduce it in the form of a story, but just make sure that you understand that I'm not talking about an individual giraffe or an individual tree. I'm talking about changes to those species over time. So the first character in this story is the acacia tree. And like all trees and all living beings, the acacia tree has certain needs, things that it needs in order to survive and thrive. And one of those things is energy. And whereas animals get their energy either from eating plants or from eating other animals, trees get their energy from the sun. And to do this, they grow out their leaves, and then their leaves transform that sunlight into sugar, which the tree can use to continue growing. So their leaves are a really important part of how they meet their needs. Now here are some giraffes, and the giraffe is the other character in this story. And just like acacia trees, giraffes also have certain things they need in order to survive and thrive. And in their case, they need to eat leaves. One of their main sources of food is the acacia tree. So whereas the acacia tree needs their leaves in order to grow, and produce energy, the giraffe needs the acacia tree's leaves in order to grow and produce energy as well. And so these two, the giraffes depend upon the tree, and the tree actually also depends upon giraffes to spread out their seeds so they can reproduce. So they both need each other, but they can also both the giraffes can overbrowse trees. And so this has led to an interesting relationship. The acacia trees have adapted to protect their leaves from being overbrowsed or losing all of their leaves through a number of adaptations. And one of those is this physical adaptation you can see here. They've grown out these long thorns, which makes it more difficult for herbivores like giraffes to feed off of their leaves. But the giraffes have also adapted. And they've adapted by, with these long tongues that are able to move around those thorns and still get to those leaves. And so these are two physical examples of this ongoing evolutionary relationship between the giraffe and the acacia tree. But it isn't just these physical, visible adaptations that have been going on. There's also adaptations that are going on under the surface, and in particular in the leaves and in the air. And to explain some of those adaptations, I'm going to show you this diagram. And I want you to imagine right now that we're looking down on a savanna habitat that has all of these different acacia trees represented as these green circles. And now let's imagine that a couple of giraffes decide to browse on this acacia tree right there in the middle. as soon as they start chewing on those leaves, something happens inside the acacia tree's leaves. And that is that those leaves release a chemical called tannins. And these tannins, first of all, make the leaves taste really bad. And at the same time, they make them undigestible. And so the giraffes are no longer able to feed upon the leaves on that tree. So they have to go to another tree. But that's not the only thing that happens. There's something else that happens inside that one tree. And that is that the tree releases a chemical called ethylene, which leaves the tree in the form of a gas. And it will travel where the wind blows it. And when it meets another acacia tree, it causes the same reaction of releasing tannins in the leaves. And so these leaves in these trees also become inedible to the giraffes. But the story's not over there, because the giraffes have adapted by, rather than feeding downwind, going from a tree here in the direction of the wind down, they feed upwind. So they go from this tree here to a tree that hasn't interacted with the ethylene from that first tree, because the wind couldn't blow it that way. And so to show you this in another format, in words, giraffes start browsing on a tree. The tree releases these tannins. The tree also releases ethylene. The wind blows the ethylene downwind. Those trees also release tannins, and the giraffes move upwind. And so we can think of these chemicals, this ethylene, as a signal. It's sending a message to the other acacia trees. And we can also think of this all as a cause and effect relationship, where there's an initial cause that the giraffes start browsing on a tree, and the final effect is that they have to move upwind to continue browsing. And if we combined all of these little causes and effects, we form what's called a chain reaction, which is like a link of chains, a link of causes and effects. And I had mentioned that, we were telling this story of the giraffes and the acacia trees. And there are a couple of ways of understanding this story. One way that people have understood this story is through what's called a root metaphor, which is a tool that we use to understand something. And a metaphor is a comparison of one thing to another. A root metaphor that a lot of people use to describe the relationship between the giraffes and the acacia trees is competition. There's this competition between them. Some have also called it an evolutionary arms race, where the giraffe keeps building these weapons that they're able to use to attack the tree, and then the trees build up these defenses to protect themselves. But today I want you to think about another root metaphor that we might be able to use to understand this relationship. And that root metaphor is a conversation between the giraffes and the trees. The giraffes need the trees, and in a way the trees also need the giraffes, but the giraffes can overuse the trees. And so one way to think about this is a conversation where these two species have learned how to meet each other's needs without compromising their needs. And so I want you to think about that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later and how that might be helpful as we think about lessons we can take from this relationship and apply to our own relationship. But first of all, I want to turn to our activity for today. And our activity is that we're going to be building a Rube Goldberg machine. You might also know of these as chain reaction machines. And it might be kind of seem random to go from giraffes and trees to a Rube Goldberg machine, but I hope that it'll make sense as we go through it. And by doing this activity, you'll be strengthening your critical thinking, problem solving, planning, and persistence skills. And the supplies you'll need are to start a field notebook and a pencil. And then these are supplies that I used for my own machine, but you can really use anything you can find around your house. Books, string, chairs, and you'll see, you'll get some ideas as I show some examples. So a Rube Goldberg machine is this complex machine that is composed of individual causes and effects that are linked together into a chain reaction. So the first step is to think about a final effect for your machine. Maybe you want it to turn off a light switch. And then you go from that final effect and start making links that go backwards towards your initial cause. And some possible links are pulleys, dominoes, and ramps, which I'll show you. And a couple of tips. One is to start simple, and then another tip is to practice persistence. If it doesn't work at first, keep trying, and eventually it will. So here's an example of an award-winning Rube Goldberg machine, just to give you a sense of what they might look like. So the initial cause is right here, turning this switch. And it starts this chain reaction. So just like the giraffe browsing on the acacia tree leads to this chain reaction that ultimately releases these chemicals and the ethylene, so too, when they turned that switch, it led to this chain reaction that led to its ultimate effect. So I decided that I wanted to try making my own Rube Goldberg machine, or my own chain reaction machine at home. And I will say mine is not as complicated as that one, but I wanted to use this as an example to show you that we can all get started. So I built an audience as I was building mine. So you can see here the start is moving this tea kettle. There's a string, a shoe, some books, another shoe, another string, and the light switch I want to turn off because it's important, to not waste energy. So that was how I had set it up. And it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. One of the challenges I faced was that the shoe would drop, but it wouldn't knock over this book. And so I wouldn't, the chain reaction would stop. But eventually, over time, I was able to figure out what to do. And this happened. So eventually I was able to get it to work, but it took a lot of persistence to do it, and it took starting simple and then building from there. So I want to go back to what I had said earlier about root metaphors and this idea of acacia trees and giraffes having a conversation. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. And I'm not saying that they're conscious of this conversation necessarily, but I think that it's helpful because it gives us some lessons that we can apply to our own relationship with other animals and the environment. And one of those lessons is realizing that other animals and the environment are sending signals, and some of these signals have to do with our actions and what our actions do, how they impact these animals and the environment. And it's easy to not realize that's happening because sometimes those signals are separated by distance or even by time, just like, the signals of the acacia trees and the giraffes are, or in these Rube Goldberg machines, the signals are separated by distance and time. But we as humans are able to start recognizing those signals. And if we can start recognizing those signals, we can start entering into these conversations with the other animals and environment that share our environment. And we can learn how to walk softly. So let's learn a little bit more about how we can do that this week. So we're going to learn how to listen to animals and the environment. And by doing this, we're going to be strengthening our empathy and critical thinking skills while also helping animals and the environment. And the supplies we'll need include a computer with internet access. So the first step, like I said, is to recognize that animals in the environment are sending us signals. And then learn how to recognize these signals. And again, sometimes it's really hard to recognize them. For example, it's really hard to see how a simple action like turning on or off a light switch can impact global climate systems. But other signals are easier to see. For example, one way that you can start recognizing these signals is to let your backyard lawn grow a little bit. let some of those flowers grow out and see what happens. You might see that pollinators start spending time in your garden. You might see more flowers starting to bloom. So if you start locally, you might be able to start recognizing these signals. And then you might also learn how to respond to these signals. As you learn to let flowers grow maybe, or to protect certain habitats, you might realize how important that is, and you might learn other ways that you can support that habitat. And then you can teach other people the same thing. As you learn about these signals, you can share them with other people. And that's something that we do at the Detroit Zoological Society. One of our mission pillars is sustainability, which refers to responsibly using resources so we can meet our needs, but we aren't compromising other living beings from meeting their needs. And we can think about this as learning how to walk softly and to listen to the signals that our environment is sending us. And if you go to our website, you can find our green print, which describes actions that we're taking at the Detroit Zoo and Belle Isle Nature Center to minimize our impact. And you can also learn what you can do. There are some tips here. We have a guide called the Shades of Green Guide, as well as a list of some things you can do to responsibly use energy, water, and other things. And that leads me to another one of our pillars, which is humane education. The DZS is home to the Berman Academy for Humane Education, which is a one-of-a-kind initiative that's allowed us to incorporate the principles of humane education into all of our educational programming. And those are summed up by helping people help animals, and also by walking softly. So I hope that as you've learned more about animal communication, you can also see ways in which we can participate in this ongoing conversation between ourselves and other animals and the environment. And I hope that you have some sense of actions you can take to start helping those other animals in the environment. Before going, I wanted to say thank you to the Ford Motor Company Fund for supporting this week's virtual Vitamin Z episodes. We really appreciate your support, as it's allowed us to continue serving our community in this way. I also want to thank you all for tuning in, and if you're interested in more virtual Vitamin Z, you can check out our website at detroitzoo.org and then click on the link for educational lessons. Until then, stay safe and have a great day. Bye.